job at IBM or some big corporate and you thought that everything was going to run somewhat more organized, you're in for a major shock when you're taking out the garbage and doing all your own payroll and everything. I'm living it. And, well, not the garbage part. Since we moved to Mars, it's been fantastic, as well as a lot of other things. Credibility, lastly, is so important. You've got to be well-researched, using data to back up assumptions. And I would say the last one that we're talking a lot about today in startup land, Lean Startup preaches it every day. You've got to be decisive. Know when to hold them, when to fold them, make the cuts, cut your losses, and pivot at the right time, because you only have so much cash. And even if you haven't raised cash, you have to think about this agility thing in a big way. It's huge. And that's it. Love to take some questions.
Thanks, Peter. We have some time for some questions. If anyone wants to go to the mic so the people on the webcast can hear.
Yeah,
Yes.
My question was about the IP portfolio. Mm-hmm. You talked about it quite a lot. Mm-hmm. Now, many startup companies who are pitching to investors will not ever have an IP portfolio. So insert what here? Because you've made it quite a big part of your pitch.
Insert a lot of things there instead of IP. A very clever business model, but even that's not necessarily sustainable if there are copycats out there. First mover advantage is not really enough in today's world. I would say that the reason I mentioned IP is that we do have a lot of scientists in the program. We have a lot of engineers. If you can get some degree of defensibility, that's great. Remember, intellectual property is trade secrets. It's all the way through to provisional and granted patents. And in many cases, I think the lawyers make more money on suing people to protect your patents than they do filing them. They've told me so. That's where the money is. And not being too flip here, but you also have to be prepared to defend your IP. I think there's two schools of thought, and one school is kind of fading. That old traditional, got to see a lot of patents, is moving by the wayside. I think now it's about momentum, it's about speed, it's about fast teams that can get around patents, can get around prior art, and in many ways it's about executing. Execution is so different in today's world. I keep saying today's world, but I've just seen profound changes in how fast you can move a business with the kind of technologies that we've got today in the cloud. And that's influencing even some of the deeper science that we're seeing as well. So back to your question, what if you don't have IP? You got to have speed, you got to have momentum, possibly a great business model. Again, another discussion, and that's a whole different lecture. What's the difference between a feature and a platform? If you've got a platform that doesn't have intellectual property, try to figure out a way that you could, with your first mover advantage, exert some degree of power in the marketplace. Patents are only one source of market power. Speed is the other one, I think, one of many. Hope that helps. It's a fairly long discussion, the answer to that one. Yes, sir.
I actually had another question, but the first question made me wonder, what's the value of a provisional patent? Is that worth patent pending just to get some
I hate to say it, it depends. I mean, it's one of those things, how high is the sky? Mm-hmm. It really is. And the question was, again, what's the value of a provisional patent? It's $3,000 to $5,000. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm going to tell you now. I mean, that's what it costs on the street. So, and I think a good lawyer would say that's what it's worth as well. What I've charged you for it, and so you can pay $10,000 for, depending on how complex it is with claims and stuff. But a very, very basic, filing would cost that. But you're back to the value discussion. It depends on, are you going to defend it? How many other people are coming in on it? I'm not dispensing legal advice. I also want to say that disclaimer. I'm not an attorney or lawyer. The value is really how well you've constructed that. And I believe the lawyers, for as good as they are, can only give you some degree of guidance as to what they feel your claims are in an area of intellectual property, unless you do a proper amount of research out there in terms of your freedom to operate. What's that battleground look like? There's no crystal ball that people have got on the IP side.
But when you go to an investor with a provisional patent, are they going to...
So here's the deal. It comes down to the thing I can say with certainty is somebody that takes the time to construct a patent that's been done by a decent law firm, a good intellectual property attorney and has gone through that process, and that attorney can vouch that they saw something there that was worth patenting, that carries something for me. I don't know what we're going to do with that later, where it's going to go, but it's helpful. It's a proxy, one of hundreds of other proxies that I'm putting into your due diligence file, and you're racking up a score. But that is only one small piece of this.
Okay.
But who are your M&A targets? Is the only potential exit to Google, and is it an algorithm? Then I would say patents factor into the discussion in a really big way. There's a good example of how it really depends what you're doing. It's such a broad question in some ways.
Okay. The question I stood up to ask was about your projections. You talked about projections. And of course, you know, that's black art.
Sure, it is.
Can you speak about how to do decent projections that people are going to...
It's a very involved subject. I mean, some people want 5. A lot of people are fine with 3. I think what you got to make sure is that your projections, they stand the test of time. So when you're presenting to multiple audiences, a good investor will sometimes divide by 3, maybe by 4, and take you down to 25% of revenues, and then say, well, what if we make our cost double what you're projecting? They're going to do stuff like that. Sensitivity testing can kill you. So make sure that you stand the test of time. What if the 4 market segments that you've projected are not going to kick in, and 2 of them kick in at 50 points of what you tell me? What if your acquisition costs are higher than what you tell me? It's not $50 a customer. Let's see what it does at 125. They may even build an independent model to assess you. Very important that you do some of that sensitivity testing yourself before you get moved around by an investor. It just shows a lot of credibility.
Okay, thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I think it presented steps in a very crystal clear fashion. So
thank you.
My question was about analogies.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer of analogies. I was very lucky this last year. I was able to study analogies very deep. I believe they are, if not the core of cognition, a very important part to communication into what it makes people understand things.
Yeah.
And I believe people are not very aware of them. So I was very glad to see you recommend to exploit the power of analogies.
Yeah.
However, when it comes to using analogies like the ones you presented, like I am the Instagram for this, I am the Uber for something, I've always had the feeling that as far as it makes your product clear, I think it also undermines it a bit.
It can. It can. That's why you have to choose it very wisely.
It undermines your originality. And I think I have this feeling that it undermines your own grasp of the market, because I feel...
So what's your background? What are you doing now?
I study neuroscience and cognitive science.
Okay.
So
you have a passion for this.
Very beautiful topic in it.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this. I mean, I get what you're saying. I think if you pick the wrong analogy or metaphor, as we will say, it can actually do a lot of damage. If people are walking around, you know, and you know, they pick the wrong one. I think the pickup line is the analogy. The dinner conversation is the rest of this that we're talking about. So you can't just go out and just use one line, you know, to pick up investors. There's a lot more conversation that needs to go on. So you can't just take one element of this and isolate it. And we're always, in the communications business, we're trying to get to successive milestones. In the cocktail conversation, we're trying to get a business card. That's success. When we get the business card and we do the pitch, we do more than just the metaphor. In fact, we may have dispensed with that altogether. That's already served its purpose. When we get through that meeting, what we want to do is get to the next meeting and into some due diligence, not get to the term sheet on the next meeting. It's probably a further unpacking of our proof and the forecasting and what sort of IP do we have. So I'm only really talking about the metaphor as one of maybe 150 major things we have to get done for an investor in the process.
Oh, no, I understand.
So to your point, you have to pick wisely. But I'm just saying the importance of that is becoming, it's actually becoming more important because people want to hear that in a conversation. And they're evaluating you very easily in that cocktail conversation. How are you coming across? You're constantly being evaluated. And that's your first test, is how good is your metaphor, if you can produce one. If you can't and you need a longer conversation with people, it just might mean that there's a bit more friction associated with your business, and that's what you're going to sign on for.
Oh, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Just conscious of the time, we'll take these last 3 questions,
Sure.
and then we'll wrap it up. Thanks.
We have the Boston-Toronto Maple Leafs game tonight, so.
I was wondering, let's say you pitched an idea to an investor or investors, and they turned you down. You went back, you revamped your pitch, made the necessary corrections.
Yeah.
Would you advise for or against pitching the idea to the same investor that turned you down?
I think what you want to do is figure out why they turned you down and understand if you think you've got an engagement strategy there. They should be forthright with you and say, you know, it's not our sector, it's not our space. It's just not aligned with what we want to do. If they're being pretty honest with you, your chances of succeeding again are fairly low because they're giving a lot of people first chances, so I'll be honest with you. But what you want to do is test for what's wrong and maybe set a conditional with them as part of selling, right? If I can rectify this and I can show you a whole different set of numbers, I can show you more proof. If I bring you some customers, you instructed me to bring a first customer, and I can show you why they bought and what they bought at, things like that, I'll do it. I think the fastest way to bring an investor around is customers. You just can't beat it. Or you hired a rock star. You've got an advisory board. You've got the team. You're proving the market opportunity, and other people are starting to sign on. So those are really engaging proxies. So one of the things I want to give you as advice is don't go off in a huff. Keep a connection with that investor because they may refer you to somebody else who becomes an investor or a client. Investors are good sources of connections across a whole variety of things that companies need. So always keep the door open and keep the lines of communication up. Put them on your house file and check in with them once in a while. Let them know what you're achieving. It's important. And they always make mistakes, every investor. Mike Moritz said Sequoia has a list of all of the great deals he's passed on. And read that if you ever get turned down by an investor, and you'll understand we're in the people business and we all make mistakes. I've turned down some pretty funny stuff over the years as well. And that's a whole beer conversation. Yes, sir. At the back.